The story of the Varangians begins in the mists of Scandinavian prehistory, when the warming climate of the 8th century transformed the harsh northern landscapes into launching points for one of history's most consequential migrations. The term Varangian derives from the Old Norse word Varingi, meaning a sworn companion or member of a confederated group, though the people who would bear this name in Byzantine sources were known by many names across the regions they traversed. In their Scandinavian homelands, they were simply Norse or Vikings. In the Slavic lands, they became known as the Rus. In Constantinople, they would achieve immortality as the legendary Varangian Guard. But their story transcends these individual labels to encompass a remarkable saga of exploration, state-building, commerce and military service that shaped the political and cultural landscape of Eastern Europe for centuries. Before we continue this journey through history, if you enjoy these deep dives into the past, please like this video and subscribe so you won't miss future stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The geographical and environmental factors that propelled Scandinavian expansion during the Viking Age created the conditions for Varangian emergence as a distinct cultural and political force. The Scandinavian peninsula's mountainous terrain and limited agricultural land meant that growing populations faced increasing pressure on available resources. The development of advanced shipbuilding techniques, particularly the shallow-drafted longship that could navigate both open seas and inland river systems, provided Scandinavian warriors and traders with unprecedented mobility. These vessels, combining speed, maneuverability, and cargo capacity, transformed the Norse from isolated northern communities into participants in long-distance trade networks and military expeditions. The eastern orientation of Swedish Vikings distinguished them from their Danish and Norwegian counterparts, who focused primarily on Western European targets. While Danish raiders terrorized the coasts of England and France, and Norwegian explorers colonized Iceland and ventured to Greenland and North America, Swedish adventurers turned their attention to the vast river systems of Eastern Europe. The natural geography of the Baltic region created logical pathways for this eastern expansion. The short distance between Scandinavian shores and the eastern Baltic coast meant that even relatively small vessels could make the crossing safely. From the eastern Baltic, numerous rivers including the Neva, the Daugava and the Volkhov provided access to vast inland territories rich in furs, honey, wax and slaves, the commodities that drove early medieval commerce. The earliest phase of Varangian activity in Eastern Europe during the late 8th and early 9th centuries remains shrouded in considerable uncertainty, with archaeological evidence providing more reliable information than the sparse written sources from this period. Swedish settlement sites along the eastern Baltic coast date to the mid-8th century, suggesting that Scandinavian traders and colonists established permanent bases well before the events described in later chronicles. These early settlements served as staging points for expeditions deeper into the interior, where Varangian merchants encountered the Finnic and Slavic populations who inhabited the forests and river valleys of what is now Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. The primary chronicle, compiled in Kyiv during the early 12th century, provides the most detailed, though highly problematic account of early Varangian activities in Eastern Europe. According to this text, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the region initially paid tribute to the Varangians, but eventually expelled them. However, the ensuing period of intertribal warfare proved so destructive that the tribes invited the Varangians to return as rulers who could impose order. This invitation, allegedly issued around 862, brought the Varangian leader Rurik and his brothers to establish themselves in Novgorod and surrounding territories. This founding narrative, known as the Calling of the Varangians, served important political purposes for the Kievan Rus state that commissioned the chronicle, legitimizing the ruling dynasty by portraying their ancestors as invited sovereigns rather than foreign conquerors. Modern historians approach the primary chronicle's account with considerable skepticism, recognizing that it was written more than 2 centuries after the events it describes and reflects the political concerns of its own time rather than providing objective historical documentation. Archaeological evidence suggests a more gradual and complex process of Scandinavian integration into Eastern European societies than the chronicle's dramatic narrative implies. Swedish artifacts appear alongside Slavic and Finnic materials at numerous sites, indicating prolonged cultural interaction and exchange rather than sudden conquest or invitation. The intermarriage between Scandinavian men and local women, evidenced by both archaeological and genetic data, demonstrates that the Varangians established permanent settlements and family ties rather than maintaining themselves as a separate military elite. The strategic importance of river systems in Varangian expansion cannot be overstated, as these waterways provided the essential infrastructure for long-distance trade and communication in the pre-modern period. The Volkhov River connected the Baltic Sea through Lake Ladoga to Lake Ilmen, from which the Lovat River provided access to the western Dvina and Dnieper river systems. These routes allowed Varangian traders to reach the Black Sea and Byzantine markets, while alternative paths via the Volga River opened connections to the Caspian Sea and the Islamic Caliphate. The portages between different river systems, where boats had to be dragged overland, became crucial points of control and sites for permanent settlements that evolved into major trading centres. The establishment of Staraya Ladoga around 750 represents one of the earliest and most significant Varangian settlements in Eastern Europe. Located at the southern end of Lake Ladoga, where the Volkhov River begins, this site occupied a strategic position controlling access to the interior river systems. Archaeological excavations at Staraya Ladoga reveal a multi-ethnic settlement where Scandinavian, Finnic, and Slavic populations lived in close proximity, engaging in craft production, trade, and agriculture. The site's defensive works, craft workshops, and evidence of long-distance trade connections demonstrate that this was no temporary raiding base, but a permanent urban centre that served as a gateway between Scandinavia and the Eastern European interior. Novgorod, located further south on the Volkhov River, emerged as the primary Varangian power centre during the 9th and 10th centuries. The city's location provided access to multiple river systems, while its position in relatively fertile agricultural lands supported a substantial population. The primary chronicle's account of Rurik establishing himself in Novgorod around 862 may reflect a historical reality of Scandinavian rulers consolidating power in this strategically important location, even if the specific details and chronology remain uncertain. Novgorod developed distinctive political institutions that balanced princely authority with the power of wealthy merchant families and popular assemblies, creating a political culture quite different from other medieval Russian principalities. The southward expansion from Novgorod toward Kiev represents a crucial phase in Varangian state building that transformed scattered trading posts into the foundation of a territorial state. According to the primary chronicle, Oleg, identified as either Rurik's kinsman or successor, led an expedition south around 882, capturing Kiev and making it his capital. The chronicle presents this as a deliberate political strategy, with Oleg recognizing Kiev's superior location for controlling trade routes and political relationships with the Byzantine Empire. Whether or not Oleg was a historical figure as described, the archaeological and documentary evidence confirms that Kiev emerged as a major power centre during the late 9th century, with a Scandinavian-descended ruling elite presiding over a predominantly Slavic population. The relationship between the Varangian warrior merchants and the Slavic populations they came to rule represents one of the most fascinating aspects of early Russian history. Unlike many other conquest situations, where conquerors maintained linguistic and cultural separation from subject populations, the Varangians underwent relatively rapid cultural assimilation into Slavic society. By the 10th century, the ruling elite in Kiev and Novgorod bore Slavic names, spoke Slavic languages, and participated in Slavic cultural practices, though they maintained connections with Scandinavia through trade, marriage alliances, and military recruitment. This cultural synthesis created a hybrid society that combined Scandinavian traditions of warrior leadership and long-distance trade with Slavic agric, cultural practices and social structures. The formation of Kievan Rus as a coherent political entity during the 10th century represented the culmination of Varangian state-building efforts in Eastern Europe. The principality combined elements of Scandinavian kingship, nomadic steppe political traditions, and Byzantine administrative practices to create a distinctive political system. The Grand Prince in Kiev claimed supreme authority over other princes who governed subordinate cities, though the practical effectiveness of this hierarchical structure varied considerably, depending on the personal capabilities of individual rulers and the shifting balance of power among rival families. The state's economic foundation rested on control of trade routes between the Baltic and Black Seas, with the collection of tribute from subject populations in furs, honey, and slaves providing the commodities that drove long-distance commerce. The primary chronicle's account of Prince Oleg's campaign against Constantinople in 907 illustrates the military capabilities and commercial ambitions of early Kievan Rus. According to the chronicle, Oleg led a massive fleet of 2,000 ships, carrying 80,000 men to attack the Byzantine capital. While these numbers almost certainly represent exaggeration, the campaign's outcome, a favourable trade treaty with the Byzantine Empire, indicates that Kievan Rus possessed sufficient military power to compel Byzantine concessions. The treaty provisions detailed in the chronicle, including terms for Russian merchants trading in Constantinople, customs duties, and procedures for resolving disputes, demonstrate the commercial motivations underlying these military expeditions. Byzantine sources confirm that traders from the north, called Rus in Greek texts, regularly visited Constantinople during this period, though Byzantine writers expressed mixed feelings about these rough northern visitors. Prince Igor, identified as Oleg's successor, continued the pattern of military pressure on Byzantium, combined with commercial relationships. The chronicle records an unsuccessful attack on Constantinople in 941, followed by a more successful campaign in 944 that resulted in a renewed trade treaty. Byzantine sources provide independent confirmation of the 941 attack, with the chronicler Theophanes Continuatus describing the devastation wrought by the Rus fleet along the Byzantine coast before Greek fire destroyed many of their ships. These campaigns reveal the Byzantine Empire's vulnerability to naval attacks from the Black Sea, as well as the commercial pragmatism that led both sides to negotiate trading arrangements after military confrontations. The reign of Princess Olga, who served as regent for her young son Sviatoslav after Igor's death around 945, marked a significant turning point in relations between Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire. Olga visited Constantinople around 957, where she received baptism and established a personal relationship with the Byzantine imperial family. Byzantine sources describe the elaborate ceremonies and gift exchanges that accompanied Olga's visit, though they remain silent about her baptism, which appears only in later Rus sources. The significance of Olga's conversion has been debated by historians, with some viewing it as a sincere religious transformation and others emphasizing its political and diplomatic dimensions. Regardless of Olga's personal motivations, her acceptance of Christianity established an important precedent that would influence later developments, even though her son Sviatoslav and most of the Rus population remained pagan. Sviatoslav, who assumed personal rule around 964, exemplified the Varangian warrior tradition in its most aggressive form. Rather than focusing on trade and diplomacy, Sviatoslav conducted ambitious military campaigns that temporarily transformed Kievan Rus into a major military power. His destruction of the Khazar Khaganate around 965 eliminated a long-established power that had controlled the Volga trade routes and collected tribute from Slavic tribes. This campaign opened new commercial opportunities while removing a potential rival, though it also eliminated a buffer between Rus territory and the nomadic peoples of the steppe. Sviatoslav's subsequent campaigns in the Balkans, where he intervened in Byzantine-Bulgarian conflicts, demonstrated overreach that ultimately led to military featuring and Sviatoslav's death in 972 when Pecheneg nomads ambushed his party returning to Kiev. The civil war that followed Sviatoslav's death nearly destroyed Kievan Rus, but ultimately brought to power Vladimir, one of the most consequential rulers in Russian history. Vladimir's consolidation of authority required defeating his brothers and suppressing various rebellions, a process that demonstrated both the fragility of the Kievan state structure and the continued importance of Varangian military forces in Rus politics. According to the primary chronicle, Vladimir initially reinforced traditional paganism by establishing a pantheon of Slavic deities in Kiev. But this religious policy soon gave way to his most momentous decision, the adoption of Orthodox Christianity as the official religion of Kievan Rus. The primary chronicle's account of Vladimir's religious choice, known as the testing of the faiths, presents the decision as a careful evaluation of different religious options. Envoys supposedly visited Muslim Bulgaria, Catholic Germany, and Orthodox Constantinople before reporting back to Vladimir, who selected Orthodox Christianity based on the splendor of Byzantine religious services. This narrative serves obvious didactic purposes, validating the choice of Orthodox Christianity over alternative religious traditions. The political and economic factors underlying Vladimir's decision were likely more significant than aesthetic preferences. Alliance with the Byzantine Empire through shared religion promised commercial advantages and cultural prestige, while Orthodox Christianity's accommodation with existing social structures, including slavery and polygyny, made it less disruptive than other religious options might have been. The baptism of Kiev in 988 represented a turning point in both Kievan Rus history and the broader story of Orthodox Christianity's expansion. According to chronicle accounts, Vladimir ordered the destruction of pagan idols and the baptism of the Kievan population in the Dnieper River. Byzantine clergy arrived to establish church structures and begin the process of Christianizing the population, though this transformation would require generations to fully accomplish. Vladimir's marriage to Anna Porphyrogenita, sister of Byzantine emperors Basil II and Constantine VIII, sealed the alliance between Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire, while demonstrating Vladimir's elevated status, as Byzantine emperors rarely permitted their sisters to marry foreign rulers. The conditions surrounding Vladimir's marriage to Anna reveal important information about the relationship between Varangians and the Byzantine Empire during this period. According to Byzantine sources, Emperor Basil II faced a dangerous rebellion by the general Bardas Phokas and desperately needed military assistance. Vladimir agreed to provide 6,000 Varangian warriors to suppress the rebellion in exchange for marriage to Anna, a deal that demonstrates both the military reputation of Varangian fighters and the Byzantine Empire's pragmatic willingness to make extraordinary concessions when facing existential threats. The Varangian forces proved decisive in defeating Bardas Phokas in 989, establishing a precedent for Scandinavian military service to the Byzantine Empire that would formalize into the Varangian Guard. The formation of the Varangian Guard as an elite unit in Byzantine imperial service represents one of the most enduring legacies of Varangian culture and military tradition. The initial 6,000 warriors provided by Vladimir in 989 established the precedent, but the Guard evolved into a permanent institution that recruited primarily from Scandinavia and later from Anglo-Saxon England. Byzantine emperors valued these foreign warriors specifically because they had no connections to Byzantine aristocratic factions and therefore could be trusted as loyal personal guards. The Varangians' fearsome reputation as warriors, combined with their relative isolation from domestic Byzantine politics, made them ideal bodyguards for rulers who faced constant threats from ambitious generals and scheming court officials. Service in the Varangian Guard offered young Scandinavian warriors extraordinary opportunities for wealth accumulation and social advancement. Byzantine emperors paid their guards generously in gold coins, while opportunities for plunder during military campaigns and special bonuses on imperial accessions provided additional income. Returning Varangians brought spectacular wealth back to Scandinavia, where their gold and silver became visible symbols of Byzantine services' profitability. Rune stones erected across Sweden commemorate men who died in Greek service, while others record successful returns from the East with substantial fortunes. These monuments provide invaluable evidence about the scale of Scandinavian participation in Byzantine military service and the cultural significance of this connection in Scandinavian society. The most famous Varangian to serve in Byzantine employment was Harald Hardrada, who later became King of Norway, and whose career illustrates the remarkable trajectories possible for ambitious Scandinavian warriors. Harald arrived in Constantinople around 1034 as a teenage refugee following his half-brother, King Olaf II's death at the Battle of Stiklestad. Over the next decade, Harald served with distinction in campaigns across the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean, fighting in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land. Byzantine sources describe Harald's military achievements and his close relationship with Empress Zoe, though they remain silent about his departure from Constantinople around 1043, which Norse sagas claim involved escape from imprisonment. Harald returned to Scandinavia with immense wealth that financed his successful bid for the Norwegian throne, and though his life ended at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 during his failed invasion of England, his Byzantine service remained central to his legend and reputation. The Christianization of Kievan Rus transformed the relationship between the Principality and the Byzantine Empire, from occasional military cooperation to sustained cultural and religious interaction. Byzantine architects and artists travelled north to construct churches and train local craftsmen in Byzantine artistic techniques. The Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, begun under Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, around 1037, exemplified this cultural transfer, combining Byzantine architectural principles with local building traditions to create a distinctive style. The development of Church Slavonic as a liturgical language, using the Cyrillic alphabet developed in Bulgaria during the 9th century, facilitated the spread of Orthodox Christianity and Byzantine literary culture, while maintaining linguistic accessibility for Slavic-speaking populations. Yaroslav the Wise, who ruled from 1019 to 1054, presided over what historians consider the golden age of Kievan Rus. His long reign brought political stability that supported economic prosperity and cultural development. Yaroslav's legal reforms, codified in the Russkaya Pravda, established written law as a foundation for governance, though much customary practice continued alongside these formal provisions. The law code's provisions regarding payments for injuries, theft, and other offences reveal a complex society with distinct social classes, including free persons, semi-free peasants, and slaves. The relatively high compensation required for killing a woman compared to contemporary Western European law codes suggests women's valued economic roles in Kievan Rus society, though their legal status remained subordinate to men. Yaroslav's foreign policy demonstrated Kievan Rus's emergence as a major European power whose alliance was sought by rulers across the continent. His daughters married kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, while his sons married into German and Byzantine imperial families. These marriage alliances integrated Kievan Rus into the network of European dynasties and facilitated cultural exchanges that brought Western European influences alongside the dominant Byzantine connections. The presence of Western European merchants in Kiev, documented in both archaeological finds and written sources, indicates that trade networks extended beyond traditional routes to the Black Sea and Constantinople to encompass connections with Central and Western Europe. The succession system that developed in Kievan Rus during the 11th century created inherent political instability that would ultimately contribute to the principality's fragmentation. Rather than primogeniture, where the elder son inherited his father's position, Rus practice employed lateral succession based on seniority within the entire princely clan. When a grand prince died, The next senior prince, typically the deceased ruler's brother rather than his son, theoretically succeeded to the Kievan throne, while all junior princes moved up to more prestigious cities in a complex rotation. This system presumed that maintaining a unified state under senior princely leadership served everyone's interests. But in practice, it created constant disputes about seniority rankings, encouraged princes to prioritize short-term exploitation of their current territories over long-term development, and prevented the emergence of stable regional power bases. The Council of Lübeck in 1097 attempted to address the succession system's inherent problems by allocating specific territories to different branches of the princely family on a hereditary basis. The assembled princes agreed that each family would retain its ancestral lands rather than participating in the rotational system, with the expectation that this arrangement would reduce conflicts by clarifying territorial rights. However, the agreement proved largely ineffective because powerful princes refused to accept permanent relegation to minor territories, while weaker princes lacked the military capacity to defend their allocated lands against ambitious relatives. The council's failure to establish a stable political order contributed to the increasing fragmentation of Kievan Rus during Tsars, the 12th century. The continuing connection between Kievan Rus and Scandinavia during the 11th and 12th centuries maintained cultural links, even as Rus society became increasingly Slavicized. Scandinavian warriors continued to seek service with Rus princes, while Norse sagas record numerous marriages between Scandinavian royalty and Rus princesses. The Varangian trade routes continued to function, bringing northern furs and other products south to Byzantine and Islamic markets, while importing luxury goods, silver, and ecclesiastical items. However, the relative importance of these connections gradually diminished as Kievan Rus developed its own cultural identity and economic networks that did not depend primarily on transit trade between Scandinavia and the Mediterranean. The Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people who dominated the southern steppe regions from the mid-11th century, profoundly influenced Kievan Rus' political and military development. Rus princes both fought against Cuman raids on their territories and allied with Cuman Khans in internecine conflicts against rival princes. These alliances often involved marriages between princely families and Cuman nobility, creating complex kinship networks that blurred the distinction between steppe nomads and settled Rus populations. Some princes recruited Cuman warriors for their military forces, while Cuman military tactics influenced Rus warfare, particularly the increased emphasis on light cavalry, rather than the infantry-dominated forces of earlier periods. The Crusades of the late 11th and 12th centuries created new opportunities for Varangian military service, while demonstrating the continuing appeal of Byzantine employment. Scandinavian warriors participated in Crusader armies travelling to the Holy Land, but many diverted to Constantinople to join the Varangian Guard or seek other military employment. Byzantine emperors utilized Varangian units extensively during this period, deploying them in campaigns against various enemies including Normans in Italy, Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, and Pecheneg and Cuman nomads in the Balkans. These campaigns exposed Varangian warriors to diverse military traditions and technologies, while maintaining the Guard's reputation as formidable fighters. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 devastated the Byzantine Empire and eliminated the Varangian Guard's traditional employer. Western European crusaders, diverted from their intended target of Egypt, instead attacked Constantinople, breaching the city's legendary walls and subjecting it to 3 days of pillage. The Varangian Guard fought to defend the city, but military defeat combined with the Byzantine imperial family's flight ended the Guard's role as protectors of Byzantine emperors. Some Varangians entered service with the Latin Empire established by the Crusaders, while others joined the Byzantine successor states that emerged in Nicaea and elsewhere. However, the Guard never regained its former prominence, and the institution gradually faded from historical records during the 13th century. The Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, beginning in 1237, destroyed the political structures that Varangians had helped create in Eastern Europe. Batu Khan's armies swept through the principality, sacking major cities including Kiev in 1240 and establishing Mongol suzerainty over the surviving Rus principalities. The devastation effectively ended Kiev's role as the primary political and cultural center of Rus civilization, while the Mongol conquest reoriented trade routes away from the Dnieper river system toward routes further east that connected to the Mongol Empire's vast territories. The princes who survived the conquest became vassals of the Golden Horde, paying tribute and seeking Mongol confirmation of their authority, a relationship that would structure Eastern European politics for more than 2 centuries. The legacy of the Varangians in Russian history has been subject to intense historiographical debate, reflecting broader questions about Russian national identity and cultural development. The Normanist controversy, which began in the 18th century and continued with particular intensity during the Soviet period, centered on the question of whether Scandinavian Varangians played a significant role in founding the Russian state, or whether Slavic populations independently developed political institutions. This debate reflected not merely academic disagreement about historical evidence, but fundamental questions about whether Russian civilization developed from indigenous roots or required external stimulation from more advanced peoples. 18th century German scholars working in the Russian Academy of Sciences, particularly Gottlieb Siegfried Bayer and August Ludwig von Schloetzer, argued that the primary chronicle's account of Varangian state building was essentially accurate, and that Scandinavian influence had been crucial to Russian political development. Russian scholars, including Mikhail Lomonosov, objected strongly to this interpretation, viewing it as an insult to Russian achievements and national pride. This scholarly dispute became intertwined with Russian political debates about Westernization versus indigenous development, with the Varangian question serving as a historical proxy for contemporary cultural conflicts. Soviet-era historiography generally adopted anti-Normanist positions, emphasizing Slavic agency in state formation while minimizing Scandinavian influence. Marxist historical frameworks that prioritized economic and social factors over the actions of individual rulers or ethnic groups, theoretically, should have made the ethnic identity of early medieval leaders relatively unimportant. However, Soviet scholars often treated the Normanist position as both politically suspect, potentially supporting claims about Russian backwardness, and methodologically flawed, relying too heavily on biased chronicle accounts rather than material evidence. Archaeological discoveries of the Soviet period, particularly excavations at Staraya Ladoga and other sites, actually demonstrated significant Scandinavian presence in early medieval Eastern Europe, though Soviet scholars typically interpreted these findings as evidence of trade contacts rather than political domination. Contemporary scholarship has generally moved beyond the Normanist controversy's polarized positions to embrace more nuanced interpretations that recognize both Scandinavian and Slavic contributions to early Russian development. Archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates substantial Scandinavian presence in Eastern Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries, with Scandinavian-style artifacts, burials, and buildings appearing at numerous sites. However, this evidence also shows rapid cultural assimilation, with Scandinavian settlers adopting Slavic languages, names, and cultural practices within 2 or 3 generations. The process of state formation in Kievan Rus involved complex interactions among Scandinavian, Slavic, Finnic, and steppe nomadic peoples, with no single ethnic group playing an exclusively determining role. The genetic legacy of Varangian settlement in Eastern Europe has been investigated through DNA studies examining both modern populations and ancient skeletal remains from archaeological sites. These studies reveal complex patterns of population mixing that reflect the historical evidence of Scandinavian settlement, followed by assimilation. Y chromosome haplogroups, common in Scandinavia, appear in Eastern European populations at frequencies suggesting male Scandinavian settlers intermarried with local women, consistent with historical accounts of Varangian warriors taking Slavic wives. However, the overall genetic impact of Scandinavian settlement was relatively modest, indicating that Varangians represented an elite warrior and merchant class, rather than a large-scale population movement. At demographically transformed Eastern Europe, the development of national origin myths in Scandinavian countries during the 19th and 20th centuries frequently incorporated Varangian history as evidence of medieval Scandinavian achievements and influence. Swedish nationalism particularly emphasized the Varangian role in founding the Russian state, presenting this as evidence of Swedish civilizing influence and historical greatness. These nationalist narratives often overlooked the rapid cultural assimilation of Varangians and exaggerated their political impact, creating simplified stories of Scandinavian conquest and state-building that served contemporary political purposes, rather than reflecting complex historical realities. The Varangian Guard's cultural legacy in both Byzantine and Scandinavian traditions reflects its significance as a meeting point between northern and Mediterranean civilizations. Byzantine sources, particularly the 11th century chronicle of Michael Psellus and the later history of John Skylitzes, describe the Varangian Guard with a mixture of admiration for their military prowess and condescension toward their perceived barbarism. Byzantine writers emphasize the Varangians' loyalty, physical courage, and effectiveness in battle, while also noting their heavy drinking, violent temperaments, and rough manners. These descriptions reveal Byzantine attitudes toward Northern Europeans as simultaneously useful military assets and cultural inferiors who lacked the sophistication of Byzantine civilization. Norse sagas and skaldic poetry provide the Scandinavian perspective on Varangian service in Byzantium, presenting it as an honorable path to wealth and glory for ambitious young warriors. Sagas about Harald Hardrada and other Varangians who served in Constantinople emphasize their military achievements, exotic adventures, and successful accumulation of wealth. These narratives present Byzantine service as a rite of passage for elite warriors, comparable to Viking raids in Western Europe, but more focused on mercenary service than plunder. The recurring saga motif of the successful Varangian returning home with substantial wealth to pursue political ambitions suggests that Byzantine service functioned as a recognized strategy for younger sons and other men without immediate inheritance proespy act to establish themselves. The runestone tradition in Sweden provides material evidence for the scale and cultural significance of Eastern connections, including but not limited to Byzantine service. Approximately 30 Swedish runestones specifically mention Greece or Greek lands, using these terms to refer to the Byzantine Empire. The stones employ various formulae, including statements that men died in Greece, went to Greece, or served in a fighting force in Greece. The geographical distribution of these stones, concentrated in the Mälaren region of central Sweden, suggests that particular communities or kinship networks maintained especially strong connections to Eastern opportunities. Other runestones commemorate men who travelled to or died in more general Eastern regions without specifically mentioning Greece, indicating extensive Scandinavian participation in Eastern enterprises beyond just Byzantine service. The linguistic legacy of Varangian activities appears in the borrowing of terms between Old Norse and Slavic languages. The most significant borrowing, the term Ross itself, likely derived from an Old Norse word related to rowing or seafaring, though the exact etymology remains debated. This term, initially used to designate Scandinavian traders and warriors, gradually broadened to encompass the entire population of the Kievan state, and eventually gave its name to Russia. Other Norse loanwords in Russian relate primarily to legal, commercial, and maritime contexts, reflecting the areas where Scandinavian influence was most pronounced. Conversely, Slavic loanwords entered Scandinavian languages, particularly terms related to trade goods and geographical features encountered in Eastern Europe. The archaeological evidence from Varangian Age burial sites reveals complex patterns of cultural identity and social organization. Scandinavian-style chamber burials containing boats, weapons, and other characteristic grave goods appear at sites including Gnezdovo near Smolensk, Shestovica near Chernihiv, and the Black Grave near Chernihiv. These elaborate burials demonstrate that some individuals maintained Scandinavian cultural traditions, even after settling in Eastern Europe. However, other burials at the same sites show mixed cultural characteristics or purely Slavic traditions, indicating that Scandinavian and Slavic populations lived in close proximity and that cultural boundaries were permeable. The presence of both cremation and inhumation burials at multi-ethnic sites reflects the religious diversity of the pre-Christian period, while the gradual shift toward inhumation during the 10th century signals increasing Christian influence. The trade goods recovered from archaeological sites illuminate the economic foundations of Varangian activities in Eastern Europe. Silver coins, both Islamic dirhams and Byzantine miliaresia, appear in hordes across the region, demonstrating participation in long-distance trade networks. The peak period of dirham imports occurred during the 9th and 10th centuries, when the Volga route connected Eastern Europe to the Islamic Caliphate, while Byzantine coins became more common after the Christianization of Kievan Rus strengthened connections with Constantinople. Other trade goods, including glass beads, silk textiles, and spices of Asian origin, indicate that Eastern European sites participated in the wider Eurasian trade system. Scandinavian exports primarily consisted of furs, slaves, hone, and wax, commodities extracted from the forest regions through tribute and trade relationships with indigenous populations. The decline of Varangian cultural distinctiveness within Kievan Rus society during the 11th century reflected broader patterns of elite assimilation into dominant local cultures. The adoption of Christianity eliminated one of the most visible markers of Scandinavian identity, as pagan religious practices gave way to Orthodox Christianity. The shift from Norse to Slavic personal names among the ruling class, largely complete by the mid-11th century, signaled acceptance of Slavic cultural identity. The abandonment of distinctive Scandinavian dress, artistic styles, and burial customs further demonstrates cultural assimilation. This transformation occurred within 3 or 4 generations of initial Scandinavian settlement, an unusually rapid pace of cultural change that suggests both the relatively small numbers of Scandinavian settlers and the prestige of Slavic culture within Kievan Rus society. The role of religious conversion in transforming Varangian identity deserves particular emphasis, as Christianity fundamentally altered cultural practices and social organization. Pagan Scandinavian religion, with its emphasis on warrior heroism, ancestor veneration, and personal honor, had reinforced values that supported the warrior merchant lifestyle of early Varangians. Orthodox Christianity introduced different values, emphasizing spiritual salvation, ecclesiastical authority, and alignment with Byzantine civilization. The requirement that converts abandoned polygyny and concubinage, practices common among elite Scandinavians, fundamentally altered family structures and inheritance patterns. The Church's opposition to slavery, though incompletely enforced, challenged the economic foundations of Varangian trade activities. These religious changes contributed significantly to the transformation of Varangian identity within Rus society. The architectural legacy of Varangian and early Kievan Rus civilization demonstrates the synthesis of Scandinavian, Slavic, and Byzantine influences that characterize this culture. The earliest fortifications in cities like Novgorod and Kiev combined Scandinavian timber construction techniques with features adapted to local conditions and threats. The introduction of stone architecture following Christianization brought Byzantine building traditions to Eastern Europe, though the adaptation of these traditions to northern climates and materials created distinctive regional styles. The Church of the Tithes in Kiev, constructed in the 990s, represented the first stone building in Kievan Rus and exemplified this cultural synthesis, combining Byzantine architectural principles with local building techniques and decorative traditions. The manuscript culture that developed in Kievan Rus following Christianization created important connections with broader Orthodox Christian civilization while maintaining distinctive regional characteristics. Byzantine scribal traditions provided models for manuscript production, with ecclesiastical texts translated from Greek into Church Slavonic, forming the core of early Rus literature. However, indigenous literary production began quickly, with chronicles, saints' lives, and legal codes reflecting specifically Rus concerns and perspectives. The decoration of these manuscripts combined Byzantine artistic influences with local decorative traditions, creating a distinctive visual style. The preservation of many 11th and 12th century manuscripts provides crucial evidence about Kievan Rus' intellectual and cultural life, though the losses from subsequent invasions and political disruptions mean that much has been irretrievably lost. The economic transformation of Eastern Europe during the Varangian period fundamentally altered the region's relationship with wider Eurasian trade networks. Before Scandinavian involvement, long-distance trade in the region operated primarily through Khazar intermediaries who controlled access to Islamic and Byzantine markets. Varangian merchants established direct trade connections that bypassed Khazar control, initially competing with and eventually supplanting Khazar commercial dominance. The decline and eventual destruction of the Khazar Khaganate during the 10th century opened the Volga and Don River systems to Rus control, though this also exposed Rus territories more directly to steppe nomads. The shift from primarily transit trade based on moving Scandinavian and northern goods to southern markets toward more diversified economic activities, including local craft production and agriculture, reflected the maturation of Rus society. The urban development that occurred in Eastern Europe during the Varangian period created a network of trading centers that became the foundation for later Russian cities. Sites that began as Varangian trading posts evolved into permanent cities with diversified economies and complex social structures. Novgorod developed into a major commercial center whose merchant oligarchy competed with princely authority for political control. Kiev emerged as the primary political and cultural capital, its location on the Dnieper River making it central to north-south trade, while its proximity to the steppe frontier gave it strategic military importance. Smaller centers including Polotsk, Smolensk, Chernihiv, and Pereyaslav formed a network of cities that served as regional political centers and commercial nodes. The fortification of these cities with timber and earth ramparts, the construction of churches and princely palaces, and the development of artisan quarters reflected their evolution from temporary trading posts to permanent urban settlements. The military technology and tactics employed by Varangians evolved significantly from the early raiding period through the era of settled principalities. Early Varangian warriors fighting in Eastern Europe relied primarily on equipment and tactics familiar from Scandinavian contexts, including swords, spears, axes, and shields, with relatively light armor. The development of the Rus principalities brought increased Byzantine influence on military organization and technology, including the adoption of lamellar armor, improvements in metallurgy, and the integration of horse archery techniques learned from steppe nomads. The composition of Rus armies shifted from primarily Scandinavian warrior bands toward more diverse forces, including Slavic infantry, Finnic auxiliaries, and nomadic cavalry allies. This military evolution reflected both technological diffusion across Eurasia and the specific requirements of defending against steppe nomads, whose mobility and archery skills required adaptive responses. The institution of the druzhina, the prince's personal military retinue, represented a crucial element linking Scandinavian warrior traditions with Rus political structures. The term druzhina, though Slavic, described an institution with clear parallels to Scandinavian warband organization, suggesting cultural synthesis rather than simple imposition of foreign practices. Družina members owed personal loyalty to their prince and received maintenance, gifts, and shares of plunder in return for military service and counsel. The senior Družina members, termed boyars, formed an aristocratic council that advised the prince on political and military matters. This institution provided continuity of military organization, even as the ethnic composition of Družinas shifted from predominantly Scandinavian to predominantly Slavic over several generations. The transformation of tribute collection from raiding and plunder toward more systematic taxation reflected the evolution from Varangian warrior bands to territorial principalities. The polyudi, the annual circuit of tribute collection undertaken by princes and their retinues, initially resembled extended raiding expeditions, where armed bands extracted goods from subject populations. The formalization of tribute obligations, the establishment of administrative centers for collection, and the development of legal codes regulating these relationships indicated increasing state capacity and more sophisticated governance. However, the primary purpose of tribute collection remained extracting resources to support the prince, his retinue, and military forces rather than providing public goods or services to subject populations. The complex relationship between Kiev and Rus principalities and Byzantine emperors during the 11th and 12th centuries reflected both parties' pragmatic balancing of cooperation and competition. Byzantine emperors sought to maintain Rus princes as allies who could pressure enemies in the northern Black Sea region, while preventing Rus from becoming threats themselves. Rus princes valued Byzantine alliance for commercial access, cultural prestige, and occasional military assistance, but resisted any Byzantine claims to suzerainty or excessive interference in the Rus affairs. The recurring pattern of Rus military threats against Constantinople, followed by treaty negotiations and renewed peaceful relations, suggests that both sides understood these confrontations as negotiations over the terms of their relationship, rather than efforts at permanent conquest or subordination. The ecclesiastical structure established in Kievan Rus following Christianization created formal institutional connections with the Byzantine Patriarchate, while also developing indigenous religious leadership. The Metropolitan of Kiev, nominally appointed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, headed the Rus church hierarchy and theoretically maintained loyalty to Constantinople. In practice, Rus princes exercised significant influence over metropolitan appointments and church affairs, particularly during periods when communications with Constantinople were disrupted or when Byzantine-Rus political relations were strained. The development of indigenous monasticism, including the foundation of the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra in the mid-11th century, created centers of religious life that were independent of Byzantine direct control, while maintaining Orthodox traditions. The cultural production of Kievan Rus during its height in the 11th century demonstrated sophisticated engagement with Byzantine models, while developing distinctive characteristics. The primary chronicle, compiled in Kyiv during the early 12th century, adapted Byzantine chronicle traditions to Rus circumstances, incorporating Scandinavian origin legends, Slavic folklore, and local historical traditions, alongside material derived from Byzantine sources. The Sermon on Law and Grace by Metropolitan Hilarion, written around 1050, represents sophisticated theological argumentation that engages with Byzantine thought while asserting Rus participation in sacred history as successors to Byzantine Christianity. These works demonstrate that Kievan Rus had developed an educated elite capable of sophisticated literary production within a few generations of Christianization. The artistic achievements of Kievan Rus, particularly in religious contexts, reveal complex cultural negotiations between Byzantine models, local traditions, and available materials and skills. The mosaics and frescoes in Kiev's St. Sophia Cathedral, created by Byzantine and local artists during the 11th century, demonstrate high technical skill and theological sophistication. However, the adaptation of Byzantine iconographic programs to Russian ecclesiastical architecture required modifications that reflected different liturgical practices and aesthetic preferences. The development of icon painting in Kiev and Rus created a distinctive regional school that maintained Byzantine theological content while developing characteristic stylistic features, including different color palettes, compositional arrangements, and emotional tones. The linguistic development of Church Slavonic as the liturgical and literary language of Kievan Rus facilitated cultural independence from Byzantine direct control while maintaining Orthodox religious identity. Unlike Western European Catholics who use Latin, a language unintelligible to most laypeople, Orthodox Slavs worshipped and read in a language closely related to vernacular Slavic speech. This linguistic accessibility had profound implications for religious culture, enabling broader participation in liturgical life and literary culture than was typical in contemporary Western Europe. The production and circulation of Slavonic manuscripts created literate networks connecting Kiev with other Orthodox Slavic centers, including Bulgaria and Serbia, fostering a sense of shared Slavic art. Hodox identity distinct from both Byzantine Greeks and Western European Latins. But the role of women in Varangian and early Rus society reveals interesting differences from both Scandinavian homeland patterns and contemporary Byzantine norms. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia suggests that women in Viking Age society enjoyed relatively high status and autonomy, controlling household resources and participating in religious activities. The Rus context appears to have preserved some of these patterns, with women from elite families exercising significant political influence, particularly as regents for minor sons. Princess Olga's regency and subsequent veneration as a saint exemplifies women's potential political roles, while the marriage alliances connecting Rus princesses with Scandinavian, Byzantine, and Western European rulers demonstrate that women served as useal diplomatic links between dynasties. However, the Christianization of Rus society brought Byzantine gender norms that emphasized female subordination and exclusion from formal political authority, gradually constraining women's public roles. The phenomenon of Rus Vikings, Scandinavian warriors recruited by Rus princes during the 11th and 12th centuries, demonstrates the continuing connection between Kievan Rus and Scandinavia even as Rus society became predominantly Slavic. Chronicle accounts mention princes recruiting Varangians from overseas for military campaigns, while Scandinavian sources record warriors travelling to Rus principalities seeking employment. These mercenaries differed from their 9th and 10th century predecessors by serving established Rus princes, rather than constituting an independent political force. The integration of these warriors into Rus military forces, their adoption of local practices, and their eventual assimilation into Rus society repeated the pattern established by earlier Varangian settlers, though on a smaller scale and with less cultural impact. The final chapter of Byzantine Varangian Guard history, during the 13th century, reflects the general decline of Byzantine power and the disruption of traditional recruitment networks. The Latin conquest of Constantinople in 1204 temporarily eliminated the Guard's primary employer, while the fragmentation of the Byzantine Empire among competing successor states reduced the resources available for maintaining elite military units. Some Varangians found employment with the Empire of Nicaea, which eventually recaptured Constantinople in 1261. But the restored Byzantine Empire lacked the wealth and power of earlier periods. The Guard's composition shifted toward Anglo-Saxon and other Western European recruits as Scandinavian connections weakened. By the late 13th century, references to the Varangian Guard virtually disappeared from sources, suggesting the institution had ceased to exist as a significant military force. The Mongol conquest's impact on the territories formerly comprising Kievan Rus ended the political structures descended from Varangian state building, while paradoxically preserving the cultural and religious identity developed during the Kievan period. The destruction of Kiev and other major cities, the imposition of Mongol suzerainty over surviving principalities, and the reorientation of trade routes away from traditional Varangian paths severed the direct connections with Byzantine and Scandinavian worlds that had shaped Kievan Rus' development. However, the Orthodox Christianity adopted during the Varangian period provided cultural continuity and institutional structures that survived Mongol domination. The Moscow Principality, which emerged as the dominant Rus power during the 10th century, claimed succession from Kievan Rus while developing new political traditions adapted to the realities of Mongol overlordship. The historiographical uses of Varangian history in modern Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian national narratives reflect contemporary political concerns and competing claims about historical legitimacy. Russian nationalist historiography traditionally emphasized Kiev's role as the origin point of Russian civilization and the continuity between Kievan Rus and later Russian states, using Varangian history to support claims about Russia's European identity and historical greatness. Ukrainian historians, particularly since Ukrainian independence in 1991, have emphasized the specifically Ukrainian character of Kievan Rus civilization and questioned Russian claims to exclusive inheritance of the Kievan legacy. Belarusian scholars have similarly asserted their nation's connection to Kievan Rus heritage, particularly through principalities like Polotsk that maintained relative independence from Kievan dominance. These competing historical narratives demonstrate how medieval history continues to inform contemporary political and cultural identities. The archaeological investigation of Varangian sites continues to produce new evidence that refines and sometimes challenges traditional historical interpretations. Modern excavation techniques, including careful stratigraphic analysis and scientific dating methods, provide more reliable information about settlement chronologies and cultural developments than earlier archaeological work. The analysis of organic materials preserved in waterlogged deposits at sites like Novgorod reveals details about daily life, economic activities, and material culture unavailable from chronicle accounts. Bioarchaeological studies of skeletal remains provide information about diet, health, population origins, and violent trauma that illuminates aspects of Varangian life absent from written sources. These ongoing investigations ensure that understanding of the Varangian period continues to evolve as new evidence becomes available. The legacy of Varangian state building in Eastern Europe ultimately transcends specific debates about ethnic origins or cultural influences to encompass fundamental questions about how political institutions develop in multi-ethnic frontier regions. The process by which Scandinavian warrior merchants integrated with Slavic populations to create the Kievan Rus state illustrates patterns of cultural synthesis, elite adaptation, and institutional innovation that have characterized many successful state-building projects throughout history. The relatively rapid assimilation of Varangian elites into Slavic society while maintaining political continuity suggests that effective governance depends less on maintaining ethnic purity than on developing institutions that serve diverse populations' practical needs. The commercial networks established during the Varangian period created infrastructure and relationships that influenced Eastern European economic development for centuries. The cities founded or developed during this era remained important commercial centers. Their locations chosen for strategic and economic reasons that retained relevance long after the specific circumstances of Varangian trade had changed. The tradition of long-distance commerce connecting northern forest regions with southern agricultural and urban zones, though disrupted by Mongol conquest, revived under later political conditions. The commercial skills and entrepreneurial culture developed during the Varangian period contributed to the emergence of powerful merchant communities in cities like Novgorod that played important roles in later medieval Russian history. The synthesis of Scandinavian, Slavic, Byzantine, and steppe influences that characterize Kievan Rus culture created a distinctive civilization that defies simple categorization within conventional historical frameworks. Not quite European in the Western sense, not entirely Byzantine despite Orthodox Christianity, and shaped by, but not subsumed into steppe nomadic culture, Kievan Rus occupied a unique position linking multiple cultural worlds. This intermediary position brought both advantages, including access to diverse trading networks and cultural resources, and disadvantages, including vulnerability to attacks from multiple directions and difficulty establishing a stable political identity. The cultural creativity evident in Kievan Rus' art, literature, and political institutions reflects the productive tensions generated by this multicultural environment. The military traditions established during the Varangian period, particularly the emphasis on elite warrior retinues personally loyal to individual leaders, influenced Russian military organization and political culture for centuries. The Druzhina system's combination of military service and political council established patterns of noble-ruler relationships that persisted through later periods despite changes in specific institutional forms. The cultural ideal of the warrior prince, personally leading troops in battle while also providing political leadership and embodying aristocratic virtues, drew on both Scandinavian and Byzantine models while developing distinctively Russian characteristics. This ideal influenced Russian political culture and military traditions well into the early modern period. The transformation of Varangian identity within Eastern European contexts provides a case study in how ethnic identities form, transform, and sometimes disappear through processes of cultural interaction and assimilation. The Varangians began as Scandinavian warriors and traders operating in Eastern Europe while maintaining distinct cultural practices and identities. Within several generations, their descendants had adopted Slavic languages and cultural practices while retaining political leadership positions and some distinctive social traditions. Eventually, the Varangian ethnic identity dissolved entirely as the descendants of Scandinavian settlers became indistinguishable from the broader Rus population. This transformation occurred through intermarriage, religious conversion, adoption of local languages and customs, and the practical advantages of assimilation into the dominant culture. The process illustrates how ethnic boundaries can be remarkably fluid under conditions of close cultural contact and intermarriage, particularly for relatively small elite groups embedded within larger populations. The Byzantine Empire's relationship with northern warriors, from initial encounters with Rus raiders through the institutionalization of the Varangian Guard to the final decline of this institution in the 13th century, reflects broader patterns of how sophisticated imperial states incorporate and utilize external military forces. The Byzantines demonstrated remarkable pragmatism in recruiting potential enemies as mercenaries, recognizing that Scandinavian warriors' military skills and political isolation from Byzantine factional conflicts made them valuable assets despite cultural differences. This pattern of employing foreign mercenaries had long precedent in Roman tradition and continued in various forms throughout Byzantine history. The specific case of the Varangian Guard illustrates how cultural difference could become a strategic advantage in contexts where political loyalty was uncertain and internal threats often exceeded external dangers. The religious transformation of former Varangians through Christianization had implications extending beyond personal belief to encompass fundamental changes in worldview, social organization, and political relationships. Pagan Scandinavian religions' emphasis on fate, heroic glory, and cyclical time gave way to Christianity's linear historical vision, emphasis on salvation and hierarchical cosmic order. The requirement to abandon practices including polygyny, concubinage, and certain forms of slavery forced changes in family structures and social relationships. The integration into Orthodox Christian civilization connected Rus principalities with broader Mediterranean and Balkan cultural networks, while separating them from pagan Scandinavia and Catholic Western Europe. These changes occurred within 2 or 3 generations, representing a remarkably rapid religious and cultural transformation that fundamentally altered the identity and worldview of Varangian descendants. The source materials available for studying Varangian history present significant interpretive challenges that require careful methodological consideration. The primary chronicle, though invaluable, was compiled centuries after the events it describes and reflects political agendas of its own time. Byzantine sources provide independent confirmation for some events, but view Rus from external perspectives with their own biases and limited information. Norse sagas offer Scandinavian perspectives but were recorded even later than the primary chronicle and combine historical memory with legendary material. Archaeological evidence provides material confirmation for population movements and cultural contacts, but cannot directly address questions about political organization or individual motivations. Interpreting this fragmentary and problematic evidence requires synthesizing multiple sources while remaining appropriately cautious about conclusions. The question of Varangian linguistic influence on East Slavic languages remains subject to scholarly debate, with competing interpretations of the limited evidence available. Beyond the term Rus itself, relatively few Norse loanwords entered Old Russian, suggesting either that Scandinavian settlement was numerically limited or that linguistic assimilation occurred very rapidly. The loanwords that do exist concentrate in semantic fields related to trade, law, and maritime activities, consistent with Varangian roles as merchants and warriors. The absence of widespread Norse influence on Slavic grammatical structure or phonology indicates that Slavic remained the dominant language even in areas of significant Scandinavian settlement. This linguistic evidence supports interpretations emphasizing relatively small numbers of Scandinavian settlers who rapidly adopted Slavic speech while maintaining some specialized vocabulary related to their distinctive social roles. The comparative perspective provided by examining Varangian activities in Eastern Europe alongside roughly contemporary Viking activities in Western Europe reveals both similarities and significant differences. In both regions, Scandinavian raiders and traders established permanent settlements and eventually integrated into local societies. However, the Western European Viking presence generally maintained more distinct cultural identity for longer periods, with Norse speech persisting in some areas for centuries and distinctive political institutions developing in Norse-controlled territories. The more rapid assimilation in Eastern Europe may reflect several factors, including the greater cultural prestige of Byzantine Christian civilization compared to fragmented Western European kingdoms, the already multi-ethnic character of Eastern European populations, and the smaller scale of Scandinavian settlement relative to local populations. These differences suggest that the specific outcomes of Viking Age Scandinavian expansion depended significantly on local conditions, rather than following a uniform pattern. The enduring fascination with Varangian history in popular culture reflects the dramatic narrative of northern warriors becoming founders of states, elite Byzantine guardsmen, and eventually assimilated into the societies they initially encountered as outsiders. Popular historical novels, films, and television series have portrayed Varangian adventures with varying degrees of historical accuracy, often emphasizing romantic adventure and military glory, while simplifying complex processes of cultural interaction and state formation. These popular representations, though sometimes historically problematic, have introduced broader audiences to this important historical topic and stimulated interest in medieval Eastern European history. The challenge for historians is channeling popular interest toward more nuanced and accurate understanding of Varangian history, while acknowledging the legitimate appeal of these dramatic narratives. The long-term significance of the Varangian period in Eastern European history lies not in the specific ethnic identity of political founders, but in the institutional foundations, commercial networks, and cultural orientations established during this formative era. The choice of Orthodox Christianity over other religious options shaped Russian cultural development for a millennium. The urban centers founded or developed during this period provided infrastructure for later economic and political development. The political traditions, combining princely authority with aristocratic counsel, though evolving over time, influenced Russian governance for centuries. The commercial orientation toward both Baltic and Black Sea trade networks established patterns of economic interaction that persisted despite changing political circumstances. These enduring legacies justify the historical significance attributed to the Varangian period, regardless of debates about the ethnic origins of early medieval rulers. The economic dimensions of Varangian enterprise in Eastern Europe deserve more detailed examination to fully appreciate how commercial motivations shaped political developments and cultural interactions. The fur trade represented the single most valuable commodity driving Varangian expansion into the northern forests. Sable, marten, beaver, and squirrel furs from the boreal forests commanded premium prices in both Byzantine and Islamic markets, where they served as luxury items marking elite status. The organization required to extract these furs from vast forest territories, transport them thousands of miles to market, and exchange them for silver and luxury goods necessitated sophisticated commercial networks and political arrangements with indigenous populations who actually trapped the animals. Varangian traders established relationships with Finnic and Slavic communities who provided furs in exchange for weapons, tools, and other manufactured goods, creating dependency relationships that evolved into tribute obligations and eventually political subordination. The slave trade, though morally reprehensible from modern perspectives, constituted another crucial element of Varangian commercial activities and requires honest historical acknowledgement. Captives, taken during raids or purchased from other raiders, were transported south to Byzantine and Islamic markets where they commanded high prices. The word slave itself derives from Slav, reflecting the unfortunate reality that Slavic captives from Eastern Europe constituted a major source of enslaved persons in medieval Mediterranean markets. The Varangian role in this trade involved both capturing slaves through military raids and serving as commercial intermediaries, transporting captives obtained from other sources. The scale of this trade is difficult to quantify from surviving sources, but its economic importance is evident from the attention devoted to slave trade regulations in treaties between Kievan Rus and Byzantium. The Christianization of Rus society theoretically should have ended the enslavement of fellow Christians, though in practice the trade probably continued in modified forms for considerable time. The honey and beeswax trade represented another significant component of Varangian commercial activities, with these products enjoying consistent demand in Byzantine and Islamic markets. Wild honey harvesting from forest bee populations provided sweetener before the availability of cane sugar, while beeswax served essential functions in religious ceremonies, illumination, and various crafts. The collection of honey and wax from vast forest territories required knowledge of bee behavior and seasonal patterns, skills possessed by indigenous forest populations. Varangian traders organized the collection and transport of these bulky products, which required substantial cargo capacity and protection against spoilage and theft during long-distance transport. The integration of honey and wax collection into tribute obligations transformed what had been subsistence activities for forest communities into commercial production oriented toward external markets. The monetary systems that developed in Kievan Rus during the Varangian period reflected the principality's position at the intersection of multiple economic spheres. Islamic silver dirhams flowed into Eastern Europe in massive quantities during the 9th and 10th centuries through trade routes connecting to the Caliphate via the Volga River. These coins circulated widely and appear in hordes throughout the region, indicating their acceptance as standard currency. Byzantine gold and silver coins entered circulation through trade with Constantinople, though initially in smaller quantities than dirhams. The decline of dirham imports during the late 10th century, caused by silver shortages in the Islamic world, created monetary disruption that contributed to economic changes including increae. Said emphasis on trade with Byzantium and the development of alternative payment methods, including furs and other commodities, serving as media of exchange. The minting of indigenous coinage by Kievan princes, beginning under Vladimir around the year 1000, represented an assertion of sovereign authority and economic sophistication. These coins, called zlatniks and srebreniks, were struck in very limited quantities and seem to have served primarily ceremonial and prestige functions rather than circulating as everyday currency. The designs combined Byzantine imperial iconography with inscriptions identifying the Rus prince, creating visual statements of political legitimacy and cultural affiliation. The small scale of production suggests that most economic transactions continue to use foreign coins, commodity money, or credit arrangements rather than indigenous coinage. However, the symbolic importance of minting coins with the ruler's image, abai, and titles should not be underestimated, as this represented a claim to the attributes of sovereignty recognized in Byzantine and Islamic political cultures. The development of credit mechanisms and commercial partnerships facilitated long-distance trade, despite the risks and capital requirements involved. The organization of trading expeditions to Constantinople or other distant markets required substantial initial investment in trade goods, provisions, and transportation before any returns could be realized. Individual merchants often lacked sufficient capital to mount these expeditions independently, necessitating partnerships where multiple investors pooled resources and shared risks and profits. These commercial associations, though poorly documented in surviving sources, must have been essential to the functioning of long-distance trade. The development of trust relationships enabling credit extension, the establishment of mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes, and the creation of market institutions facilitating exchange all represented crucial but often invisible infrastructure supporting the visible phenomena of trade goods moving across vast distances. The role of women in Varangian commercial activities remains difficult to assess due to source limitations, but evidence suggests significant female participation in economic life. Archaeological finds of trade goods in women's graves, including scales and weights used for measuring silver, indicate that some women engaged in commercial activities. The management of household economies, which in elite families could involve substantial resources and numerous dependents, required sophisticated economic skills. Women's textile production, both for household use and for trade, represented economically valuable labor. The legal codes of Kievan Rus, while subordinating women to male authority in many respects, recognized women's property rights and economic agency in ways that enabled their participation in commercial activities. The extent of women's involvement in long-distance trade, as opposed to local market activities and household production, remains uncertain and probably varied considerably based on social status and family circumstances. The integration of Jewish merchants into Kievan Rus commercial networks added another layer of complexity to the region's multi-ethnic trading culture. Khazaria, the Turkic state that controlled the lower Volga region before its destruction by Sviatoslav, had adopted Judaism as the royal religion, creating a major center of Jewish culture and commerce in Eastern Europe. The Khazar collapse dispersed Jewish merchants throughout the region, including into Rus territories. Byzantine Jewish merchants also traveled north for trade, maintaining commercial networks connecting Constantinople with Eastern European markets. The role of Jewish merchants in facilitating trade, providing credit, and transferring commercial information contributed significantly to Kievan Rus' economic development, though their activities are poorly documented in predominantly Christian sources that often expressed religious prejudice. The periodic expulsions and restrictions on Jewish communities that occurred in later periods were not characteristic of the Varangian era, when commercial pragmatism generally overrode religious exclusivity in trading contexts. The transportation infrastructure required for Varangian trade involved both natural waterways and humanly constructed improvements facilitating commerce. The portages between river systems, where boats and cargo had to be moved overland, represented crucial choke points that required maintenance and protection. Some portages involved relatively short distances over flat terrain, where boats could be dragged on rollers, while others required carrying cargo substantial distances over rough ground. The communities that controlled major portages could extract tolls and provide portage services, creating economic opportunities that supported permanent settlements at these strategic locations. The seasonal limitations on river navigation, with ice blocking travel during winter and low water level, sometimes impeding transport during summer, necessitated careful timing of trading expeditions and the development of storage facilities for goods awaiting transport. The maritime aspects of Varangian activity extended beyond river navigation to include coastal and open sea voyages in the Baltic and Black Seas. The vessel types employed for different purposes varied considerably, from small boats suitable for river transport to larger sea-going ships capable of carrying substantial cargo and navigating rough waters. The Scandinavian shipbuilding tradition provided technological foundations, but adaptation to Eastern European conditions required modifications in design and construction. The availability of suitable timber for shipbuilding influenced settlement patterns and economic development, as shipbuilding centres required access to forests producing appropriate trees. The skills required for ship construction, navigation, and seamanship represented valuable cultural capital that Scandinavian settlers brought to Eastern Europe, contributing to the development of maritime capabilities in the region. The diplomatic dimensions of Varangian commercial activities involved negotiating treaties, establishing trading rights, and maintaining relationships that enabled peaceful commerce. The treaties between Kievan Rus and Byzantium, preserved in the primary chronicle, provide detailed information about the regulation of trade, including provisions for merchants visiting Constantinople, procedures for resolving disputes, terms of inheritance for Rus merchants dying in Byzantine territory, and obligations regarding the return of shipwrecked cargo. These treaty provisions reveal sophisticated understanding of the legal issues arising from long-distance trade and the willingness of both parties to establish formal frameworks governing commercial interactions. The requirement that Rus merchants CA arori official seals identifying them and limiting the number who could enter Constantinople simultaneously demonstrates Byzantine concerns about security while accommodating the commercial relationship. The cultural exchanges facilitated by Varangian commercial networks extended far beyond simple trade in goods to encompass technological transfer, artistic influences, and the spread of religious ideas. Byzantine luxury goods arriving in Kiev and other Rus cities introduced new aesthetic standards and technological possibilities, stimulating local craft production, attempting to imitate or adapt these imports. The movement of skilled craftsmen, including Byzantine artists employed in church construction and decoration, brought technical knowledge alongside finished products. Religious texts, liturgical items, and ecclesiastical expertise travelled north along the same routes that carried furs and slaves south. These cultural flows, though asymmetric with Byzantine influence predominating, created opportunities for synthesis and innovation as Rus craftsmen and intellectuals adapted foreign models to local conditions and preferences. The environmental impacts of Varangian commercial activities, though impossible to quantify precisely, deserve consideration for understanding the broader consequences of trade expansion. The intensive hunting of fur-bearing animals to supply trade probably reduced some populations, particularly of species like sable that commanded highest prices. The expansion of settlement and agriculture to support growing urban populations and produce surplus for trade involved forest clearing that altered landscapes. The demand for timber for shipbuilding, fortifications, and fuel placed pressure on forest resources in areas surrounding major settlements. These environmental changes remain modest compared to later industrial impacts, but nonetheless represented significant alterations in local ecosystems. and resource availability. The sustainability of fur trade, in particular, depended on maintaining animal populations capable of regeneration, creating economic incentives for avoiding overexploitation that sometimes conflicted with short-term profit maximization. The role of seasonal rhythms in organizing Varangian commercial and military activities reflected the practical constraints imposed by climate and geography. Winter travel on frozen rivers and snow-covered ground offered advantages for some transport, but made waterborne commerce impossible. The spring thaw and high water levels created optimal conditions for downstream river travel, making this the preferred season for expeditions to Constantinople and other southern markets. Summer conditions varied depending on rainfall, with drought potentially reducing water levels below those required for navigation of loaded vessels. Autumn presented opportunities for final trading expeditions before winter closure, while also requiring preparation of provisions and supplies for the cold season. These seasonal patterns structured the annual calendar of activities, with military campaigns and trading expeditions concentrated in warmer months, while winter brought relative quiescence and focus on local activities. The religious pluralism of the Varangian period, before the Christianization of Rus established Orthodox Christianity as dominant, created a complex spiritual landscape where pagan Scandinavian practices, Slavic folk religion, and imported monotheistic traditions coexisted and interacted. The pantheon of gods honored by pagan Scandinavians included Odin, Thor, Freyr, and other deities familiar from Norse mythology, while Slavic populations venerated their own gods, including Perun, Veles, and Svarog. The religious practices associated with these belief systems, including animal sacrifice, divination, and ancestor veneration, continued alongside and sometimes merged with Christian practices during the transition period. The existence of small Muslim and Jewish communities in Rus cities added further diversity, though these remained minority populations whose religious practices had limited influence on the broader society. The gradual and incomplete nature of Christianization meant that pagan beliefs and practices persisted for generations, particularly in rural areas distant from urban ecclesiastical centers. The ceremonial and ritual aspects of princely authority in Kievan Rus combined Scandinavian, Slavic, and Byzantine elements to create distinctive traditions legitimizing political power. The installation of new princes involved ceremonies drawing on multiple cultural sources, including both pagan oath-taking traditions and Christian coronation rituals. The public display of wealth through gift-giving, feast hosting, and conspicuous consumption demonstrated a ruler's power and generosity, maintaining warrior loyalty and popular support. The conduct of military campaigns included ritualized elements, from pre-battle religious observances to the celebration of victories with elaborate feasts distributing plunder among warriors. The construction of churches and monasteries represented not merely religious devotion, but also assertions of political authority and wealth, with the architectural grandeur of these structures serving as visible monuments to princely power. The judicial systems operating in Kievan Rus reflected the combination of customary law inherited from both Scandinavian and Slavic traditions, with innovations responding to the needs of increasingly complex society. The Ruskaya Pravda, the earliest written law code, codified penalties for various offences, using a system of monetary compensation, called vera, that attempted to replace violent retaliation with regulated payments. The distinction between crimes requiring compensation to individuals and offences against the prince, or public order, demonstrated emerging concepts of state authority beyond simply mediating disputes between parties. The legal status of different social classes, clearly delineated in the law code's provisions, reveals a hierarchical society where penalties and rights varied significantly based on one's position in the social order. The administration of justice, combining princely authority with community participation through assemblies, reflected ongoing negotiation about the proper balance between centralized and local control. The military organization of Kievan Rus during the 10th and 11th centuries evolved from the early Varangian warband model toward more complex forces capable of defending extensive territories and conducting diverse types of operations. The core princely retinue, the družina, remained crucial, but was supplemented by urban militias drawn from city populations, auxiliary forces contributed by subject peoples, and temporary alliances with nomadic groups. The integration of these diverse forces required developing command structures, logistics systems, and tactical coordination more sophisticated than those needed for the small raiding parties of early Varangian warriors. The construction and maintenance of fortifications, including the elaborate defensive lines built to protect against steppe nomad raids, represented substantial investments of labor and resources requiring organizational capabilities beyond purely military matters. The relationship between Kievan Rus and the steppe nomads who dominated the grasslands south and east of Rus territories profoundly influenced military development, trade patterns, and political strategies. The Pechenegs, who emerged as a major threat during the late 10th century, conducted devastating raids that threatened Rus settlements and disrupted trade routes. The Byzantine policy of alternately allying with and manipulating various nomadic groups to advance imperial interests created complex diplomatic situations where Rus princes had to navigate relationships with both Byzantium and the nomads. The construction of fortified lines and the settlement of military colonists along the steppe frontier represented systematic efforts to defend against nomadic raids while extending Rus territorial control. The later emergence of the Polovtsi, known in Western sources as Cumans, as the dominant steppe power during the 11th century, required continued adaptation of defensive strategies and diplomatic approaches. The cultural memory of the Varangian period preserved in later Russian chronicles, folklore, and historical consciousness demonstrates how early medieval events were interpreted and reinterpreted to serve the needs of subsequent generations. The primary chronicle's narrative, written in the early 12th century, presented the Varangian founding of the Rus state in terms that legitimized the contemporary political order and reinforced cultural identities. Later, chronicle compilations modified and expanded this narrative, adding details, emphasizing different aspects, and adapting the story to new political circumstances. The transformation of historical figures into legendary heroes, particularly in the byline-y epic poetry tradition, demonstrates how folk culture preserved and transformed memories of the past. These various forms of cultural memory, though historically problematic as sources for actual events, provide invaluable evidence about how later societies understood their origins and constructed identities based on interpretations of their history. The material culture of the Varangian period, recoverable through archaeological investigation, provides crucial information about daily life, technological capabilities, and social organization that supplements and sometimes contradicts written sources. The analysis of dwelling structures reveals information about family organization, social stratification, and technological practices. The study of craft production sites illuminates economic specialization and technological skills. The examination of burial practices provides insights into religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and cultural identities. The reconstruction of diet through analysis of food remains, and human skeletal chemistry reveals nutritional patterns and access to different food sources. The investigation of trade goods, distribution patterns, traces commercial networks and exchange relationships. These material sources, though requiring careful interpretation, offer perspectives on past societies that are independent of the biases and limitations inherent in written sources. The technological innovations associated with the Varangian period, though incremental rather than revolutionary, cumulatively transformed capabilities in agriculture, craft production, and warfare. Improvements in metallurgy enabled better quality weapons and tools, while advances in textile production increased the variety and quality of available fabrics. Agricultural innovations, including improved ploughs and crop rotation practices, supported larger populations and greater surplus production. The development of more efficient ship designs enhanced cargo capacity and navigational capabilities. These technological changes, often involving the adoption and adaptation of techniques from other cultures, contributed to economic development and military effectiveness. The transmission of technologies through trade contacts, craftsman migrations, and deliberate efforts to acquire foreign expertise demonstrated the advantages of cultural openness and the economic value of technological knowledge. The linguistic evidence preserved in place names, personal names, and borrowed vocabulary provides important information about population movements and cultural interactions during the Varangian period. The concentration of place names of Scandinavian origin in particular regions suggests areas of intensive early Scandinavian settlement. The transition from Scandinavian to Slavic personal names among the ruling elite traces the process of cultural assimilation. The specialized vocabulary relating to trade, law, and military organization demonstrates areas where Scandinavian influence was most pronounced. The analysis of these linguistic traces requires careful methodology to distinguish genuine early borrowings from later scholarly reconstructions, but when properly analyzed provides valuable evidence complementing archaeological and documentary sources. The comparative study of the Varangian experience in Eastern Europe, alongside other medieval frontier societies, reveals both unique characteristics and common patterns. The Spanish Reconquista, the German expansion into Slavic territories east of the Elbe, the Norman conquests in England and southern Italy, and the Crusader states in the eastern Mediterranean all involved the establishment of new political entities in frontier regions through combinations of military conquest, colonization, and cultural interaction. The comparison of these different cases illuminates factors influencing the pace of cultural assimilation, the persistence of distinct ethnic identities, and the development of hybrid cultures. The Varangian case stands out for the rapidity of cultural assimilation and the relative absence of sustained ethnic conflict, suggesting that specific local conditions rather than universal patterns determined outcomes in frontier societies. The economic integration of Eastern Europe into wider Eurasian commercial networks during the Varangian period represented a significant development in world economic history. The establishment of regular trade routes connecting Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, Byzantium, and the Islamic world created a northern tier of the medieval world economy, parallel to the better-known Mediterranean and Middle Eastern commercial centers. The flow of silver from Islamic mines through Eastern European intermediaries to Scandinavian regions influenced monetary systems and economic development across vast territories. The trade in slaves, furs, and other commodities represented substantial economic transactions with significant impacts on both producing and consuming regions. The incorporation of Eastern European territories into these trading networks brought previously peripheral regions into contact with the economic and cultural innovations of more developed civilizations, accelerating local development processes. The legacy of Varangian Christianity, as mediated through Byzantine traditions, shaped Russian religious culture in ways that distinguished it from Western European Catholicism. The use of Church Slavonic in liturgy created linguistic accessibility that facilitated lay participation in religious life, while potentially limiting intellectual engagement with Greek theological traditions. The emphasis on monastic spirituality and hesychast mystical practices, drawn from Byzantine traditions, created distinctive forms of Russian Orthodox piety. The subordination of church to state authority, inherent in Byzantine Caesaropapism and reinforced by Mongol overlordship patterns, established political relationships between religious and secular authorities different from Western European church-state conflicts. The artistic traditions of icon painting and church architecture developed distinctively Russian styles that maintained orthodox theological content while adapting Byzantine models to local conditions and aesthetic sensibilities. The demographic impacts of the Varangian period remain difficult to quantify, but undoubtedly included significant population movements and mixing. The migration of Scandinavian populations to Eastern Europe, though modest in absolute numbers compared to the resident Slavic and Finnic populations, introduced new genetic lineages and cultural practices. The forced movement of enslaved populations from various regions through Rus territories created further demographic mixing. The concentration of population in urban centres, facilitated by trade-generated wealth and political centralisation, altered settlement patterns and social organisation. The mortality associated with warfare, disease, and the harsh environmental conditions of the period influenced population dynamics in ways that remain poorly understood, given source limitations. The overall trajectory was one of population growth and increased urbanisation, though with significant regional variations and periodic setbacks from epidemics, famines, and military conflicts. The artistic achievements of the Kievan Rus period demonstrate how the synthesis of multiple cultural influences could generate creativity and innovation. The manuscript illumination tradition combined Byzantine iconographic programs with Slavic ornamental patterns and local interpretations of religious themes. The development of distinctive architectural styles adapted Byzantine church plans to available building materials and climatic conditions while incorporating local aesthetic preferences. The metalwork and jewellery production combined Scandinavian decorative traditions with Byzantine techniques and steppe-influenced motifs. The textile arts, though less well preserved, show evidence of sophisticated weaving and embroidery techniques producing fabrics that served both practical and aesthetic functions. These artistic traditions, while heavily influenced by Byzantine models, developed characteristics that distinguished Kievan Rus production from both Byzantine and Western European art. The intellectual life of Kievan Rus, as evidenced by surviving manuscripts and chronicles, demonstrates engagement with Byzantine literary and theological traditions alongside the development of indigenous cultural production. The translation of Byzantine ecclesiastical texts into Church Slavonic made Greek theological and liturgical works accessible to Slavic-speaking audiences, though this translation process necessarily involved adaptation and sometimes simplification of complex theological concepts. The compilation of chronicles recording both sacred and secular history established literary traditions of historical writing that would continue throughout Russian history. The composition of original hagiographies, theological treatises, and secular literature demonstrated that Kievan Rus had developed an educated elite capable of sophisticated intellectual work. The educational institutions associated with churches and monasteries, though modest compared to Western European universities or Byzantine higher education, provided training in literacy and religious knowledge to selected individuals. The architectural evolution in Kievan Rus, from timber construction towards stone building techniques, marked a significant cultural and technological transition, influenced by Byzantine models, but adapted to local conditions. The earlier Scandinavian and Slavic structures utilized timber extensively, a logical choice given abundant forest resources and traditional building expertise. The introduction of stone church architecture following Christianization required not only new technical skills, but also substantial organizational capacity to quarry stone, transport heavy materials, and coordinate large construction projects. The Church of the Tithes in Kiev, commissioned by Vladimir shortly after his conversion, represented the first stone building in Rus territories and required Byzantine craftsmen to provide technical expertise. The cathedral's destruction during the Mongol invasion of 1240 means that our knowledge of its original appearance depends on archaeological investigation of its foundations and later textual descriptions. The subsequent development of stone church architecture in Kiev and other major cities during the 11th century demonstrated increasing local mastery of construction techniques alongside continued Byzantine influence. The Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kyiv, begun under Yaroslav the Wise around 1037, represents the peak of Kievan architectural achievement, combining Byzantine architectural principles with local adaptations. The building's 13 domes, unusual in Byzantine practice, created distinctive silhouette that became characteristic of Russian church architecture. The interior decoration with mosaics and frescoes brought Byzantine artists to Kiev, while also training local craftsmen in these techniques. The iconographic program combined standard Byzantine religious imagery with portraits of Yaroslav's family and court scenes, demonstrating the use of religious art for political purposes alongside spiritual functions. The spread of stone church construction beyond Kyiv to other major cities, including Novgorod, Chernihiv, and Polotsk, during the 11th and 12th centuries, indicated both the dispersal of technical knowledge and the political ambitions of princes who commissioned these prestigious structures. Each regional centre developed somewhat distinctive architectural characteristics, while maintaining overall adherence to Byzantine-derived principles. Novgorodian church architecture, for example, evolved towards simpler, more austere forms compared to Kievan elaboration, reflecting both regional aesthetic preferences and the practical limitations of available resources and expertise. These regional variations, though subtle during the Kievan period, would become more pronounced as political fragmentation increased after the 12th century. The monastic institutions that developed in Kievan Rus following Christianization played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge, providing social services, and maintaining connections with broader Orthodox Christian civilization. The Kyiv Pechersk Lavra, founded in the mid-11th century by monks seeking isolated spiritual practice in caves along the Dnieper bluffs, evolved from eremitic beginnings into a major monastic center. The monastery's development of Cenobitic monasticism, where monks lived in community under a common rule, followed Byzantine models while adapting to local conditions. The Lavra's role in chronicle compilation, manuscript copying, and training educated clergy made it central to Kievan intellectual life. The monastery also served as necropolis for prominent figures and pilgrimage destination, functions that enhanced its prestige and influence. The hagiographic literature produced in Kievan Rus monasteries provides valuable evidence about religious culture, social values, and political relationships, while also revealing the adaptation of Byzantine literary models to Rus circumstances. The lives of Saints Boris and Gleb, sons of Vladimir murdered in succession conflicts following their father's death, established an important cult that both reinforced dynastic legitimacy and provided exemplars of Christian virtue. The accounts of these saints emphasized their passive acceptance of martyrdom rather than resistance, presenting this as the highest form of Christian witness. This emphasis on suffering and non-resistance reflected Byzantine theological influences, while also serving political purposes, by discouraging violent resistance to established authority. The subsequent canonization of Vladimir and Olga as equal to the apostle saints demonstrated the incorporation of political founders into the sacred history of Rus Christianity. The relationship between monasticism and political authority in Kievan Rus involved complex negotiations about the proper spheres of spiritual and temporal power. Monasteries depended on princely patronage for land grants, legal protections, and material support, creating relationships of dependence that potentially compromised spiritual independence. However, abbots of major monasteries could exercise moral authority and serve as political mediators, precisely because they stood somewhat outside the immediate structures of secular power. The Pechersk Lavra's resistance to metropolitan appointment by the Kievan prince demonstrated that monasteries could assert spiritual autonomy against political pressure. The development of monastic land ownership and economic enterprises created material foundations for institutional independence, though also generating potential conflicts over resources and jurisdictions. The daily life of monks in Kievan Rus monasteries combined Byzantine liturgical practices with adaptations to local climate and conditions. The monastic offices, consisting of multiple daily prayer services, structured time according to spiritual rather than secular rhythms. The work requirements, including manuscript copying, craft production, and agricultural labour, balance spiritual practice with practical necessities. The dietary rules, emphasising fasting and abstinence from meat, required adaptations given the northern climate and limited growing seasons. The communal living arrangements, with cells for individual monks and common spaces for worship, meals and work, reflected Byzantine monastic models while accommodating available building materials and construction techniques. The balance between isolation from secular society and engagement through hospitality, charity, and teaching represented ongoing tensions within monastic life. The role of pilgrimage in Kievan Rus religious culture connected local communities with sacred sites in Jerusalem, Constantinople, and elsewhere, while also establishing domestic pilgrimage destinations, including the Pechersk Lavra and other monasteries containing important relics. The difficulties and dangers of long-distance pilgrimage to the Holy Land made such journeys significant spiritual undertakings that brought prestige to those who completed them. The accounts of Russian pilgrims visiting Constantinople and Jerusalem provide valuable information about travel conditions, religious practices at these sites, and the impressions foreign places made on Rus visitors. The development of domestic pilgrimage sites created more accessible opportunities for religious devotion, while also generating economic benefits for monasteries hosting pilgrims. The veneration of relics, particularly those of locally significant saints, established connections between universal Christian traditions and specifically Rus holy figures. The role of women in Kievan Rus religious life combined Byzantine traditions of female monasticism with local practices and constraints. Female monasteries, though fewer and generally less wealthy than male institutions, provided religious vocations for women and served as repositories of female learning and cultural production. The entrance of elite women into monasteries sometimes resulted from genuine religious calling, but often reflected political calculations, with widows or daughters of princes retiring to convents as alternatives to remarriage or to remove potential succession complications. The restrictions on women's roles in church hierarchy, following orthodox practice that excluded women from priesthood, limited female religious authority to monastic contexts. However, within monasteries, abbacies exercised significant authority, and some women achieved recognition as spiritual guides and ascetics. The practice of private devotion in elite households, evidenced by personal icons, prayer books, and domestic chapels, supplemented public liturgical worship and provided opportunities for individual spiritual expression. The commissioning of icons and liturgical objects served both devotional purposes and as displays of wealth and piety. The practice of maintaining private chaplains among wealthy families ensured regular access to religious services and pastoral guidance. The integration of religious observances into daily routine, including prayers at specific times, fasting periods, and celebration of feast days, structured time according to sacred calendar alongside agricultural and political rhythms. These private devotional practices, though less documented than public religious observances, probably occupied significant time and attention for those with resources to support them. The development of religious art in Kievan Rus, particularly icon painting and manuscript illumination, adapted Byzantine theological and aesthetic principles to create distinctively Rus artistic traditions. The theological understanding of icons as windows into the divine, rather than mere representations, required artists to follow established iconographic conventions, while also bringing personal skill and inspiration to their work. The use of specific colours, compositions, and symbolic elements followed traditions that ensured theological correctness while allowing for artistic variation. The production of icons required not only artistic skill, but also spiritual preparation, with icon painters expected to maintain prayer and fasting disciplines. The veneration of icons as holy objects distinct from ordinary images reflected Byzantine theological positions developed during the iconoclastic controversies, though the specific practices of icon veneration in Rus contexts showed some local variations. The economic role of churches and monasteries in Kievan Rus society extended beyond their spiritual functions to include significant involvement in production, trade, and land ownership. Monastic communities engaged in agriculture, craft production, and sometimes trade to support themselves and fund charitable activities. The grants of land and privileges by princes provided economic foundations, while creating relationships of dependence and obligation. The accumulation of wealth through donations and bequests enabled monasteries to serve as lenders and investors, though such commercial activities sometimes generated criticism as inconsistent with spiritual purposes. The employment of labor, both by hired workers and through various forms of dependent peasants attached to monastic lands, involved monasteries in the social relationships and potential exploitations inherent in medieval agricultural economy. The balance between religious mission and economic necessity represented ongoing challenges for monastic institutions. The integration of folk beliefs and practices into official Christianity demonstrated the complex process by which a new religion becomes established in societies with existing spiritual traditions. The continuation of pre-Christian practices related to agriculture, healing, and life cycle rituals, alongside Christian observances, created syncretic religious cultures where people maintained dual allegiances or creatively combined elements from different traditions. The Church's response to these practices varied from accommodation, where Christian meanings were grafted onto existing customs, to opposition and efforts at suppression. The persistence of beliefs in spirits, magical practices, and divination alongside Christianity suggested the incomplete nature of Christianization, particularly in rural areas. The eventual development of distinctively Russian Orthodox folk Christianity incorporated elements from various sources into patterns of belief and practice that differed substantially from Byzantine models while remaining recognizably Orthodox. The apocalyptic expectations and millennial thinking present in medieval Christianity influenced Kievan Rus religious culture, though perhaps less intensely than in some Western European contexts. The approach of the year 1000, calculated from the presumed date of Christ's birth, generated apocalyptic speculation in some Christian communities, though the calendar confusion and varying calculations meant different groups anticipated the apocalypse at different times. The Byzantine tradition of calculating time from creation, rather than from Christ's birth, created alternative chronological frameworks that shaped expectations differently. The interpretation of military defeats, natural disasters, and social disruptions as signs of approaching end times provided religious explanations for historical events while reinforcing calls for repentance and spiritual renewal. The complex relationship between linear historical time, moving toward apocalyptic culmination, and cyclical liturgical time, endlessly repeating sacred events, created tensions within Christian temporal consciousness. The festival calendar structuring the year in Kievan Rus combined Christian feast days with seasonal rhythms of agricultural life. The major feasts, celebrating events in Christ's life and honoring important saints, provided focal points for communal celebration, religious observance, and social interaction. The Paschal cycle, with its movable celebration of Easter and related observances, created variable elements in otherwise stable annual patterns. The saints' days honoring specific holy figures, both universal Orthodox saints and locally venerated Rus saints, provided numerous occasions for religious commemoration. The integration of these Christian observances with seasonal festivals, marking agricultural transitions, created complex calendars, where religious and practical concerns intertwined. The fasting periods, particularly Great Lent before Easter, imposed dietary restrictions and spiritual disciplines that structured significant portions of the year. The development of distinctively Rus liturgical music during the Kievan period, though poorly documented and imperfectly understood, represented another area where Byzantine influences merged with local practices to create new cultural forms. The Byzantine tradition of unaccompanied vocal music for liturgical use provided models that Rus church musicians adapted. The development of znameny chant, characterized by specific melodic patterns and notation systems, created distinctive musical traditions that would evolve throughout Russian Orthodox history. The training of singers and the establishment of church choirs required institutional support and systematic instruction. The theological understanding of liturgical music as integral to worship rather than mere accompaniment elevated the importance of musical excellence while creating expectations that could be difficult to meet in smaller or poorer communities. As we reach the conclusion of this comprehensive exploration, the legacy of the Varangians emerges as far more than a simple tale of Scandinavian conquest or adventure. It represents a crucial chapter in the formation of Eastern European civilization, demonstrating how cultural boundaries can dissolve through sustained interaction, how political institutions emerge from combinations of diverse traditions, and how religious transformation can reshape entire societies. The Varangians, who arrived as foreign warriors and traders, became the ancestors of peoples who would build enduring civilizations. Their own distinct identity, disappearing through assimilation even as their contributions to state building, commerce, and cultural development left permanent marks on Eastern European history. The educational and scholarly achievements of Kievan Rus during its golden age deserve particular recognition for demonstrating how quickly a society can develop sophisticated intellectual culture when provided with models and motivation. The literacy rates, though low by modern standards and concentrated among clergy and elite laymen, compared favorably with contemporary Western European societies. The production of books, requiring expensive materials and skilled labor, indicated substantial investment in learning and culture. The development of libraries in monasteries and princely courts created repositories of knowledge accessible to educated individuals. The training of scribes capable of copying manuscripts accurately and producing new works demonstrated institutional commitment to education. These achievements occurred within a century of Christianization, a remarkably rapid development that speaks to both the capabilities of Rus society and the effectiveness of Byzantine cultural transmission. The legal consciousness evident in Kievan Rus through the Ruskaya Pravda and other sources reveals societies grappling with questions of justice, social order, and appropriate responses to wrongdoing that remain relevant today. The shift from private vengeance toward regulated compensation systems represented progress toward more orderly dispute resolution, though violence remained endemic. The recognition of different social statuses with corresponding rights and obligations reflected hierarchical social structures common to medieval societies. The attention to property rights, inheritance rules, and commercial regulations demonstrated societies developing complex economic relationships, requiring formal legal frameworks. The limitations of these legal systems, particularly regarding enforcement and equal application, remind us that formal law represents ideals not always realized in practice. The environmental knowledge possessed by Varangian and Rus populations, though transmitted orally and rarely recorded in written sources, enabled successful adaptation to challenging northern climates. The understanding of seasonal patterns, weather prediction, and natural resource management supported agricultural and hunting activities. The knowledge of plant properties for food, medicine, and other purposes represented accumulated wisdom passed across generations. The navigation skills required for long-distance river and sea travel demanded intimate familiarity with currents, winds, landmarks, and seasonal variations. This practical environmental knowledge, though less celebrated than theological or artistic achievements, proved essential for survival and prosperity in harsh environments. The gradual loss of some traditional knowledge as societies urbanized and specialized represents a recurring pattern where modernization involves both gains and losses. The question of what might have been, always speculative but illuminating, invites consideration of alternative historical paths the Varangians might have followed. Had they maintained stronger connections with Scandinavia while resisting cultural assimilation, Eastern Europe might have developed quite differently, perhaps with a Scandinavian ruling class governing Slavic subjects in ways similar to Norman rule in England. Had they adopted Islam rather than Orthodox Christianity, aligning with the powerful Abbasid Caliphate, the entire religious and cultural orientation of Eastern Europe would have been transformed. Had they maintained paganism longer or adopted Western Christianity, connections with different religious and political networks would have shaped alternative development paths. These counterfactuals, though unproven, highlight the contingency of historical outcomes and the significance of choices made by historical actors. The heritage tourism and popular historical interest in Varangian history demonstrates continuing fascination with this period and its significance for understanding contemporary identities. Archaeological sites, including Staraya Ladoga, attract visitors interested in experiencing places where Varangians lived and worked. Museums throughout Scandinavia and Eastern Europe display artifacts from the Varangian period, making material culture accessible to broad audiences. Historical reenactment groups recreate Varangian military practices, crafts, and daily life, providing experiential understanding of past societies. Popular media, including novels, films, and television series, bring Varangian stories to mass audiences, though often with significant artistic license. This popular engagement with history serves important functions in connecting people with their past, while also requiring critical evaluation to distinguish entertainment from accurate historical understanding. In the quiet of this evening, as we contemplate these distant events, we recognize that the story of the Varangians speaks to timeless human experiences of migration, adaptation, and the creation of new identities in unfamiliar lands, themes that remain profoundly relevant in our own interconnected and constantly changing world. The courage required to venture into unknown territories, the adaptability necessary to succeed in foreign environments, the creativity involved in synthesizing different cultural traditions, and the ultimate triumph of shared humanity over initial differences all resonate across centuries. The Varangians remind us that boundaries between peoples, though often fiercely defended and seemingly permanent, can prove surprisingly permeable when circumstances bring different groups into sustained contact. Their legacy encourages us to remain open to cultural exchange, to recognize the potential for creative synthesis when different traditions meet, and to appreciate the complex, multi-ethnic foundations underlying societies that sometimes present themselves as ethnically homogeneous. As the last light fades and sleep approaches, the story of the Varangians offers both fascinating historical narrative and enduring lessons about human adaptability, the fluidity of cultural identity, and the remarkable achievements possible when diverse peoples work together to build something new. The limitations on what can be known about the Varangian period must be honestly acknowledged, alongside the substantial body of evidence that does exist. The written sources, primarily the primary chronicle and Byzantine texts, present fragmentary, biased, and sometimes contradictory information filtered through the perspectives and agendas of their authors. The archaeological evidence, though substantial and growing, provides information about material culture and settlement patterns, but cannot directly address questions about political motivations, cultural identities, or individual experiences. The linguistic evidence reveals patterns of cultural interaction, but remains subject to interpretive debates. The genetic evidence provides information about population relationships, but cannot specify the timing or circumstances of population mixing. The combination of these various types of evidence enables scholars to develop increasingly sophisticated understandings of the period, but significant uncertainties and disagreements remain regarding fundamental questions about political organization, cultural identities, and historical causation. As the evening deepens and this narrative draws to a close, the story of the Varangians remains a testament to the transformative power of cultural encounter and adaptation. These Scandinavian warriors and traders who ventured down Russian rivers seeking fortune and glory could not have imagined that their descendants would build Orthodox Christian principalities, that their name would be preserved in Byzantine chronicles and Scandinavian sagas, or that historians a millennium later would debate their role in founding Russian civilization. Their legacy transcends questions of ethnic origins to encompass the fundamental historical processes by which diverse peoples interact, merge, and create new cultural formations. In the vast forests and rivers of Eastern Europe, under the domes of newly built churches, and in the halls of Byzantine emperors, Varangians lived, fought, traded, and eventually merged into the peoples among whom they had settled, leaving behind a legacy that shaped the course of Eastern European history. The story of their transformation from Scandinavian raiders to founders of states, from pagan warriors to Orthodox Christians, from outsiders to ancestors of the peoples they encountered, speaks to the enduring human capacity for adaptation, the fluidity of cultural identities, and the creative possibilities that emerge when different civilizations meet and mingle. As we reflect on this distant past, the Varangians remind us that the boundaries between peoples are often more permeable than they appear, that cultural exchange can generate innovation and creativity, and that the origins of nations and civilizations are inevitably more complex and multicultural than simplified nationalist narratives suggest. Their story, though separated from us by a millennium, continues to offer insights into the processes of cultural change, political development, and human adaptation that remain relevant to our own interconnected and multicultural world.